Hello, this is Alan Elliott, and this is SAS Essentials Mastering SAS for Data Analytics, 3rd edition. This is Chapter 7, Part 2, Macros, for SAS Advanced Programming Topics. In this Part 2 of Chapter 7, we're going to be looking at how to create and use SAS macros. As usual, if you'd like to follow along with these examples, please make sure you've downloaded the files from this location. Okay, let's get started. This is an introduction to using SAS macros. Macros is a powerful programming tool within SAS that lets us to set aside repetitive sections of code and use them again and again as they're needed. We can also create dynamic variables called macro variables within the code that can take on specified values. So we're going to talk about two types of macros here. A macro variable, which is that symbolic name that can take on other values, and a macro process, which is a set of SAS code lines that can be called to do repetitive tasks. So let's look first at creating and using SAS macro variables. So a SAS macro variable, as it says, is a variable. It's a powerful programming concept that allows you to write code that can be easily changed to reflect new values. For instance, I'm going to write a large program which I'm going to use again and again, but there are a few variables in there, or a few things I want to change in that code, depending on when and where I'm going to run it. Maybe it's the year name, the month day, the disease name, the data set name. If I code those as a macro variable, I can oftentimes make some minor change at the top that would make these substitutions all throughout the program, almost like a copy and paste or a replace like you would do in a word processor. So let's take a look at what that is. First of all, to create a macro variable, we use a let statement, a %let statement. We say %let macro variable name equal text. It's important to know that a macro variable name is always text, as we're going to see. For example, suppose you have a program that calculates values based on a given year and a comparison based on the value DEPT. You can create a macro variable called year and DEPT department using these statements. So for instance, %let year equal 2015, %let department equal engineering. Now we refer to those macro variables by placing an ampersand as a prefix to the variable name in some SAS code. Thus, once I've defined these macro variables at the beginning, I can then somewhere in my code use them. For instance, here's one called IND day equal month, day, year, 7, 4, and then ampersand year. So what's going to be put in that ampersand year? It needs to be a real variable. Well, what's going to be? It's going to be 2015 because I set it earlier using the let statement above. And again, I could use that ampersand year many times throughout my program, and making that one change up here, year equal 2015, if I change it to 2014 or 2025, whatever it is, then it is automatically going to be used in the rest of my program. Now let's look at a different macro variable substitution. In this case, we're going to look at the DEPT macro variable, and we're going to set the value to group equal ampersand DEPT, and that's going to be resolved as and seen in the SAS code as group equal engineering. Notice that we have quotations around this because that's the way that we would want it to be if we wrote it by hand. Therefore, we have to put the quotations up here around the DEPT as well. So that's a little bit tricky. You have to get used to that. But whenever SAS needs the quotation marks in normal code, then we put it there even though we have a substitution there. And then down at the bottom we can have title analysis for, and DEPT again would be substituted with engineering for the year and in whatever year we had in there. Now here's some additional information about macro variables. First of all, you can create a blank or a null macro variable. I'm going to call it is null. So percent let is null equal, and then there's nothing there, blank, completely blank. And that's going to have a null value, or nothing. It's also important to understand that any leading or trailing blanks in a macro text are ignored. For instance, if I have let city equal Dallas, or let city equal blank Dallas, those are all going to resolve to the same thing. All right, let's look at hands-on example 7.8. Open up the program file called macro1.sas, and you'll see this code here, where we start out by percent let dname equal, and there's a what I'm calling a directory name, or a Windows name of a file called subjects. It's located on the C drive SAS data. And then I also have a variable I'm going to call a macro variable called variables. That's age and time exposed. Now, if I have these defined, I can then, in a proc means, for instance, or in any program, proc, I could say proc means data equal and put in the ampersand dname. And that's going to be resolved by that text that's above there that I defined. Now again, notice we have to put that in quotes because SAS expects the Windows file name to be in quotes. And then the var statement is going to be var ampersand variables. And again, that's going to be resolved by age blank time exposed. So as you can see, when you do a proc means, you can substitute, or any proc, you can substitute things in there. And then when we run the program, it resolves so that we notice down here at the results, we see that the two variables, age and time exposed, from that data set are now used to create the means that are shown here. Now we can also combine macro variables. So, and this comes in handy too, because maybe you have data names that change or paths that change, things like that. So I'm going to define both the path and the DSN, which I'm going to call data set name. So there's the path, C:\SAS data, and the data set name is some data. And again, well, I'm going to have a couple of other ones that I'm going to use here in a minute, class and select var. But let's look at the proc means. If I say data ampersand path ampersand DSN, and just sort of shove them together like that, that actually resolves to C:\SAS data / some data. So if I have two macro variables, I can just sort of shove them together and they'll concatenate. Now, there could be a problem here, an ambiguity. What if I have a variable, let's call it status, which I'm going to call pre, but I want to combine it with the word production. Now, production is not a variable. Production is just some text. So if I tried to use and status production, that wouldn't work. Or if I said and status and production, that wouldn't work because production is not a macro variable. So the way to solve that is I say and status dot production, and that resolves to and status production without the dot. All right, so let's look at an example here, 7.9. Open up the file called dmacro2.sas, and we see that we've defined the path and the DSN, and also the class and the select variable. So as we've seen before, we can concatenate those easily by simply putting them one after another. And then notice here we have class, ampersand class, var, ampersand select var. So we have now created this proc means, and when we run this, all of these macro variables will then be resolved into the text that we have defined above in the percent let statements. So again, when we run that program, we see that everything was resolved, and we have the variables there listed, age, time 1 through time 4, just as we had chosen or set in the percent let statements. Okay, let's look at creating callable macro routines. So we've looked at creating macro variables, but now we're going to look at a series of statements that performs like a SAS program, but it is actually a routine, almost like a subroutine. Instead of hard coding this routine with fixed values, you write code so that certain portions of the code can be altered using macro variables. And then once a macro routine is defined properly, you can use it again and again in your program. In fact, using a macro routine is called, we're going to refer to that as calling the macro. All right, a macro routine syntax is shown here. Here's the simplified syntax of a SAS macro. It begins with %macro, and then the macro name, and optionally some parameters we'll talk about. And then you notice it says put SAS code here, so that's going to be where you put whatever your SAS code you want to happen when the macro routine is called. And then the macro ends with a %MEND, and then also the macro name again. So that's the general format. We'll look at it more precisely now. All right, so this is a little bit about how a macro code works. So the information between the %macro and the %MEND statement is the SAS macro routine consisting of other kinds of SAS code. The macro name is the name you give to the macro, and this name should obey the standard SAS naming conventions. The parameter list that I mentioned is a way to send information to the macro, which we'll illustrate in a little bit. And within the SAS macro, between the macro and MEND, the variables referenced in the parameter list then become macro variables within the macro and can be referred to with the standard macro variable syntax that we've seen earlier. All right, so here's a simple SAS macro. This one is called report, so I have macro report, and then I have some parameters here, notice, subj, comma, dsn. These are the two variables I'm going to send information to this macro, and then I'll be able to use that information within the macro. And then we have MEND, report, which ends the macro, and then we're going to look at how to call the macro using the % and then the macro name. So let's look closely at this. So we have data report, set %dsn. Now that's the data set name. And you see that is one of the pieces of information sent as a parameter called dsn, but then I refer to it within the macro as ampersand dsn, just like we did with the SAS macros earlier. Same way with subject, subj. I refer to the ampersand subj as it is the value of the SAS macro. Now notice here I also have a variable called subj. Don't mix those up, and I have that intentionally just to show you that ampersand subj is a macro variable, whereas subj, just referred to by itself, is actually just a regular SAS variable. And notice I have report on subject number, and there's the subject macro name again, and a proc print. All right, now so that's what's inside the macro, and then below where I have %report, notice I have open parentheses subject subj equal 001. So you can see now I'm sending the report the value 001 in as the value for the subj macro name. So anywhere then within the macro where you have ampersand subj, it becomes 001. And same thing with dsn, the dataset name, as you can see there. Okay, so what happens when the macro is called? So the report macro is compiled by SAS, and a call to it using the example information does the following. The values assigned to subj and dsn are sent into the macro routine. Within the macro routine, they're referred to as ampersand subj and ampersand dsn. Wherever those macro variables are found, then the value sent in is substituted for the value for the value of subj. So for this example, the SAS code after the substitution becomes as follows. So you see we have data report set, and then there within the quotes was dsn, and we see now it's C:\SAS data subject. And we have if subj is 001. So again, we see the substitute that was made in there, and also in the title 001. So we see how that substitution will make. Again, it's sort of like a copy replace within a program. Okay, and then once SAS replaces the values with substitution, then it runs the code. And then again, briefly, just to show you in sort of a flowchart manner, we begin with the SAS macro at the top. And as SAS reads that in, it defines the macro. And then we send it information using the percent report. So the macro is called. And then it substitutes all the information in the SAS code. And now we see the third item is all the information replaced with the information that we use to call the macro. And then finally the program is run and output if needed or if created is shown. All right, so let's look at an example. Here's example 7.10. This example illustrates how to use a SAS macro routine. Let's open the program called dmacro3.sas and note that we have a series of macro calls. We have the report that we created, and now we're going to have three calls to that. Percent report subject to 001, 017, and 040, and the data set name stays the same for all three calls. Now, when we do these calls and run the program, SAS then is going to produce three reports. So the first report, it's a very brief report, but basically it went in there in the SAS code, and you see in the title it replaced the number in the title to first time 001, which is the subject number, and then it gave us the information that we asked for, gender, time exposed, and diagnosis, or diagnosed. So it does the same thing for 17 and 40. And so this is a way to create a little report. I realize this one is short enough that it doesn't make sense to do this for such a small data set, but if you had a very large data set and occasionally you want to extract particular information on a subject, then having some sort of report like this would be a way to get that done. All right, let's look at using a macro with no parameters. So we saw that the report macro had two parameters to it, but we actually don't have to have any parameters. We could simply say macro, some macro name, have any SAS code in here. In this case, we wouldn't have any that contained any SAS macros necessarily, and then MEND to end it. And so you can, legitimately, that would be then a SAS macro without calling or using any parameters. We can also create a number of SAS macro routines that give us what we want again and again. So instead of including this macro code in our program where we're going to be calling it, what we usually do is put the macro code somewhere dynamically in the program. By what I mean is instead of including the actual code, we just include a call to the macro, and we do that using a percent include statement. So for instance, we're going to show you a little program called dmacrodisclaim.sas. It has a little disclaimer in there, is all it does. It just prints out a few lines of information. You can go in there and look at that file if you want to. But all it does is it prints out a few lines that's going to become a disclaimer. And so if we want to use that macro called dmacrodisclaim, which may be a part of some macro in a large library of macros that we have, at the beginning of our program, we put the percent include and then the name of the macro. In this case, it's C:// data dmacrodisclaim.sas in quote. And then we put that at the top of our program, and then once we run the program, it can be then called anywhere in our program, as we're going to see. All right, so let's do this. Let's open up the program file first.sas. We've seen that one before. And on the line before the data statement, enter this include statement that we just talked about. And then on the line after the run statement, enter disclaim. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's our completed program, where the first program, first.sas, is all the stuff in the middle, is just simply entering a data set called employees and then doing a proc means. But before that, we include the SAS macro called dmacrodisclaim.sas, and that brings in that code that then allows us as many times as we want. Now, I'm calling it once here, percent disclaim at the very bottom, but I could call it as many times as I wanted to. So, and that's the purpose of a macro. Define it once, call it many times. So when I run that program, this is what I get. So I get the normal output that we saw early on in the first.SAS program, which was simply some means and standard deviations, etc., from on the variable age. But then look at the bottom; it put in this little disclaimer that that is included as a part of the macro. So anytime I want this disclaimer to appear in my output, I simply put that %disclaim. Now this comes in handy, for instance, if you ever work on a project that was maybe funded by a grant or is a governmental program that you're in, and it needs to be have this information displayed on the output, then instead of having to put code in there every time you need to have this occur, you can simply create this little disclaimer or whatever you want to have in there, and then call it whenever you need it. All right, let's take a look then at using the SAS macro %do loop. Now we saw do loops earlier, but this is a special kind of do loop, one that is within a macro. So the SAS %do loop statement is similar to the previously discussed do loop, but this version, in this version, we're able to define increment macro variables that take on dynamic values, and we'll see that in an example here coming up. In this case, the %do statement has to appear within a SAS macro routine, but unlike the standard do loop, it doesn't have to appear within a data step. So here this is what it looks like. So I say do a macro variable start to stop by whatever increment. So it looks like a regular do statement pretty much, except we have these % signs on all of the key words there. Okay, let's take a look at an example of a do loop. For example, in the following do loop, we have %do I equal 1 to 5. Now, the difference now in this do loop, since it's within a macro, and we're using the %do, the I becomes a macro variable. So I can now use this I as we go through this loop as a macro variable within other code. So here if I say data GP and I, that resolves to GP1, and then GP2, GP3, GP4, GP5. So that's one use of the I. And then also I have it in a where statement, where status equal. And in this case, the first time through it's 1, and then 2. So you can see how now I can use that new macro variable I within the code in this do loop. All right, let's look at this hands-on example 7.12. Open the program called macro4.sas, and we see this code here where I have macro groups count, and that means I'm going to create a macro called groups, and I'm going to send it some information called count. Then within the macro, I have a do loop where I have I equal 1 to count, and the same thing that we saw earlier. The only difference here is now I'm sending this information and count. So instead of going from 1 to 5, now it's going to go from 1 to whatever I say the count is going to be. And then I have the end there. But then when I call it, if I say %groups count equal 5, then I have my do loop going from 1 to 5. Or I could say 4, 3, whatever I want to say it. And now I have more ability to call this macro routine and change something in it in an instant simply by sending it a piece of information like this count variable. And this is what I would get in this. So here I have groups count equal 5, and then it's going to run through all of those. And I'm only showing the first two here. I'm going to proc print group 1. So notice the data set resolved to GP1, as I saw in the code, and the second time it resolved to GP2. So here are my first two data sets that I created for status 1 and status 2 using the resolved data set name code GP1, GP2, GP3, and so forth. All right, let's look at another way to use macro variables or create macro variables, and that is with the symput statement. The call symput statement routine assigns a value to a macro variable within a data step. So the call does not have to be within a macro variable, although it can be. And the syntax is as follows. Call symput, a macro variable name of our choosing, and then comma, a value. Now the macro variable name is the name you want to assign some value. So let's look at an example. Here's, open up the example 7.13 dmacro5.sas. So I'm going to create a macro called car info, and then which place is the piece of information I'm going to send into this macro. I'm going to create a data set called null. Sometimes I do this. I don't want to actually create a data set. So when I create a data set called null, it allows me to pretend I'm in a data step, but it's not actually going to create a data, any data. It's just going to do whatever I've put in code in here. And sometimes I want to do that. Maybe I just want to print out some stuff or do some other things, but I don't want to actually create a data set. All right, so I call symput, and I'm going to create a variable called timeVar, and I'm using this concatenate function we saw earlier, where I concatenate the macro variable called which place. So notice I send in which place, and then I use ampersand which place in this call here, and then a dot in MPG, which is going to resolve to which place MPG. So the title is going to be my timeVar, and also I'm going to do a proc means using timeVar, whatever that is. So, and then we have the end of the macro. So let's call it. So if I say car info equal which place equal city, so what is that going to do? It's going to resolve the timeVar to, so which place is equal to city, and then MPG. So it's going to resolve to city MPG. And I have, so city MPG is a variable within a data set, so I can use that to actually do a proc means, and where I have the var statement up there where it says var equal ampersand timeVar, that's going to resolve into var city MPG, which is a variable within the cars data set. And the result is this. So I see now I have an analysis variable, and notice here that and timeVar resolved to city MPG, and so I have the analysis variable of city MPG on this data set. It gives me the means and other things. So again, I was able to piece together some pieces of information and to resolve it into some information that allowed me to do an analysis like I wanted to. And again, I'll just reiterate. So we're looking at very short programs here, which really doesn't make sense to do very short programs like this with macro variables. But if you have a longer program, a program that's changed often, it's much simpler in the long run to put macro variables in that program, and then at the top of the program to specify what you want those macro variables to be, and it gives you a cleaner and really more reliable program in the long run. All right, so that's the end of chapter 7. So we provided a lot of information on this chapter, and particularly the macro variables, being able to generalize code is very, very helpful in the long run, and I suggest that you maybe go through those examples again and again until you understand what's going on. And then we'll go to chapter 8 here, which is controlling output using ODS. So thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope it was helpful. If it was, please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you.